Imagine waking up to a thick, hearty stew, bubbling away in a pot, simmering for hours or even days over a crackling fire. That's the essence of pottage, the medieval peasant's lifeline. It was more than just a meal. It was a constant presence in the lives of those who relied on it to survive. A meal that could be made from the simplest ingredients. It was the ultimate waste not, want not dish. One that endured through the harshest times, from famines to plagues. At its core, pottage was a versatile stew made from grains like rye or oats, which were boiled down into a thick, porridge-like consistency. It wasn't fancy, just basic grains that could easily be stored and were cheap to grow. But here's the kicker. Pottage wasn't meant to be a one-off dish. It was endlessly adaptable, with new ingredients tossed in as others were eaten. The beauty of pottage was its ability to stretch over several days, meaning that even in times of scarcity, there was always something to eat. As some ingredients were used up, fresh root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots would be added to the pot, ensuring there was always something simmering away. Wealthier households might fancy up their pottage with spices, meats, or even a bit of wine, but for peasants, that wasn't an option. Instead, they made do with whatever they could find, often using local herbs such as garlic, parsley, or sage to enhance the flavor. Even on special occasions, or after a lucky hunt, they might toss in a small piece of salt, pork, or bacon. Not enough to make a full meal of meat, but enough to infuse the entire pot with flavor. But here's the thing. Pottage was more than food. It was a practical solution to the tough conditions of medieval life. In a world where resources were limited, this never-ending pot of stew helped sustain families through long days of grueling labor. It was a reliable source of calories and nutrients that kept peasants going. It didn't have the luxury of variety, but it did its job keeping them full enough to get through the work of the day. And if there's one thing medieval peasants were good at, it was making the most out of what little they had. Let's move from the stew pot to the hearth, where bread was the cornerstone of every peasant's meal. Forget about fluffy, airy loaves or artisanal sourdough. Medieval bread was dense, heavy, and often more like a brick than the soft loaves we're used to today. It was made primarily from rye or barley, grains that could thrive in poor soil where wheat couldn't grow. The bread wasn't just a food, it was essential, a source of nearly all the calories peasants consumed on a daily basis. In fact, bread accounted for over 60% of a medieval peasant's caloric intake. Now, this wasn't some pristine, soft, store-bought loaf. It was hard, tough, and dense, sometimes requiring a good dunk in pottage or ale to even make it palatable. But it filled the belly, and that's what counted. The best wheat was reserved for the wealthy, leaving peasants with the lower-quality grains, often mixed with other fillers like peas, acorns, or even tree bark in desperate times. Talk about making do. And while the bread was necessary for survival, it came with some serious risks, specifically from rye fungus, which could cause poisoning, known as street Anthony's fire. Imagine biting into your daily bread only to be met with hallucinations and convulsions. Not the kind of surprise anyone wants with their meal. Despite the potential dangers, bread held a sacred place in medieval life. Wasting bread was considered sinful after all. It was often the only thing between peasants and starvation. During famines or hard winters, when grain supplies dwindled, peasants would turn to gruel, a thin, watery dish made by boiling whatever grains were left with water. Gruel wasn't much more than empty calories, but when nothing else was available, it was the only thing that kept people from going completely hungry. If you're lucky, it might have a pinch of salt for flavor, but that's about it. The point is, bread wasn't just food. In medieval society, it was the anchor of the peasant diet. The process of making bread wasn't fast. It was slow, labor-intensive, and done in communal ovens once a week. And when bread became too stale or hard to eat, it was reused, dunked in pottage, boiled in water, or even soaked in ale to soften it. Peasants did whatever they had to in order to avoid wasting a precious calorie source. Ultimately, medieval bread was the lifeline that kept peasants going. Hard, dry, and often dangerous, it was far from glamorous. But in a world where survival was a constant battle, bread was the hero that helped get them through another day. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the unsung hero of the medieval peasant diet, the turnip. While today, you might find this humble root vegetable tossed aside in favor of flashier ingredients, in medieval times, turnips were absolutely vital. These little guys could grow in the worst soil and required minimal care, making them the perfect crop for peasants who had limited resources and small plots of land to work with. If you wanted something that could survive the harshness of winter and still provide a decent meal, look no further than the trusty turnip. These root vegetables were incredibly versatile. Both the roots and the leaves were consumed, making sure that no part went to waste. The root would be chopped up and tossed into stews and soups, adding bulk and a much-needed base. During the long, cold winter months, fresh vegetables were hard to come by, and turnips were one of the few that could be stored for months in cool, dry conditions, ensuring that peasants had a reliable food source through the leanest times of the year. Turnips also played a dual role, not just as a food, but also as a crop that could be grown with little effort. The peasant's life was all about making things as efficient as possible, and turnips were the embodiment of that approach. You might think of turnips as a side dish, but back then, they were more than just a vegetable. They were a crucial food source that provided calories during times when the more glamorous foods were out of reach. The basic preparation was simple. Chop up the turnips, add some water, and cook until soft, sometimes seasoning with salt if available. This would form the base of many meals. Think of it like the medieval equivalent of a simple, comforting meal that you could whip up when everything else seemed out of reach. But there's a catch. Turnips might be reliable, but eating them every day, sometimes for weeks on end, could make meals feel pretty monotonous. Some medieval writers even noted that peasants ate turnips until their skin took on the power of the root itself. Now, that's an image I didn't need in my head. Eating the same food day after day without much variety could have some side effects, both physically and mentally. But for the medieval peasants, turnips were the bread and butter of their diet, providing necessary nutrition and keeping them going through the worst of times. Now, while turnips were awesome in their own right, let's not forget that they were also practical. In an era before refrigeration, storing food for months was a challenge. Turnips were easy to store and lasted a long time, unlike many other vegetables that spoiled quickly. This made them invaluable, especially as a winter food. Imagine a time when fresh produce wasn't available in supermarkets year-round, and you had to rely on what you could grow or preserve. Turnips were the kind of crop that could be buried in the ground, kept in cool storage pits, and still be edible months later. You couldn't ask for a more reliable vegetable. On top of all that, turnips had medicinal uses as well. In some regions, folk healers would prescribe turnip juice for coughs, and even use turnip poultices for skin ailments. Talk about a multi-purpose vegetable. As it turns out, turnips weren't just filling bellies, they were also helping people fight off sickness. But despite their versatility and nutritional value, turnips weren't exactly celebrated in the same way other foods might have been. After all, who's going to host a grand feast around a turnip? But when you're living in a harsh, survivalist society, you quickly learn that reliability matters a lot more than culinary sophistication. One of the real marvels of turnips, though, is that they were essentially self-sustaining. Once you planted them, you didn't need to babysit them. They grew relatively quickly, and even if you forgot about them for a while, they still managed to survive. They're the kind of food you want on your side when life gets tough. When other crops failed or were too finicky, turnips were there, ready to step in and make sure you didn't go hungry. The downside? Well,
And wouldn't you
sometimes
know, the sheep was
turnips were
wearing a
just too
bonnet.
much of a good thing. Day
Oh,
in
you are
and day out,
jesting with us.
they became the mainstay of the medieval diet.
The herring is
And when you've
perfect
eaten
this
something
time.
for weeks
The
without
stew
much
is hot,
variation,
eat well.
you begin to feel like you're becoming the vegetable itself. It's a necessary evil, but it's a reality of a world where food was not always abundant and variety wasn't guaranteed. But the turnip was always there, providing calories, nutrients, and enough sustenance to keep people moving. And let's be real, even though turnips didn't make the dinner table sparkle, they were the kind of food you could always rely on. And during the rough winters and lean months, that's really what mattered. There's something comforting about knowing that you can plant it, store it,
Look there by the
and
roots,
forget about
child.
it
Yes,
until
put
you
it
need
right
it.
here with the others.
It was the medieval
We need
version
many
of a
for the
workhorse
winter.
vegetable, keeping peasants alive and working
wonderful,
day
doesn't it?
after day,
The wild
year
garlic
after year.
really brings out
When
the
you think of
flavor.
a medieval peasant's diet, you probably
wait to try
imagine
it.
a lot of bread and vegetables. But what about protein? The truth is, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of having steak and eggs for breakfast every day. Meat was a rare luxury, only eaten on special occasions, so they had to get their protein from legumes, specifically beans and peas. These humble little beans and peas were incredibly nutritious. Dried peas contained about 25% protein by weight, which, let's be honest, makes them a pretty solid protein source when meat is nowhere to be found. These legumes were easy to grow, and what's even better is that they were environmentally friendly. Unlike other crops, peas and beans fix nitrogen in the soil, making them perfect for growing in fields where the soil was starting to get worn out. They were the ultimate sustainable crop, providing essential nutrients while also improving the land they were planted in. Peasants didn't just snack on a handful of beans and peas, they made them into something filling. Once dried, peas and beans were often soaked overnight, boiled, and then mashed into a thick paste. This wasn't the kind of thing you'd post on Instagram, but it got the job done. It was a nutritious paste that packed a punch of energy and kept the peasants going through their grueling daily labor. When times were tough, and bread and pottage were the only options, this simple pea and bean mash became the primary meal for the day, often served with bread or a splash of ale for a little extra flavor. There's something oddly satisfying about knowing that these simple, everyday legumes helped to fuel hard work, even when life was far from easy. When you look at how peasants made do, it's pretty clear. Beans and peas were a nutritional powerhouse. They were rich in protein and other essential nutrients like iron, which was crucial during times when fresh meats and other protein sources were scarce. Plus, they could be stored for years, which made them invaluable during harsh winters or times of famine. Dried peas were so reliable that even monasteries would keep thousands of pounds of them in storage, providing enough food for the monks to survive, even when everything else was running low. Let's take a quick moment to appreciate that storage ability. In a time before refrigeration, anything that could be stored for months or even years was like gold. You couldn't always count on fresh veggies or meat to get you through the year, but you could count on your dried peas. These little legumes were dried and stored in clay pots or wooden barrels, making them easy to access during times of scarcity. Imagine walking into a peasant's home and finding a sturdy barrel of dried beans that could be turned into sustaining meals for months. It's a beautiful thing, right? However, let's not sugarcoat it. Eating peas and beans day in and day out wasn't exactly the stuff of gourmet cooking shows. Yes, they provided the necessary calories and protein, but the taste? Well, let's just say it was more about sustenance than flavor. The simple pea mash might not win any Michelin stars, but it did something even more important. It kept people alive. The basic, no-frills meals were a testament to the peasants' ingenuity. They worked with what they had, making something basic into something that sustained them through rough times. Of course, peasants didn't just boil peas and beans into a tasteless mush. On the rare occasions when there was a bit of salt or some wild herbs to add flavor, they'd mix it in. That little pinch of flavor was like gold in the world of medieval food. Imagine the joy of finally getting some spice after weeks of bland meals. It was a small win, but for the peasant, those small victories in flavor were a huge deal. Even with all the benefits, though, eating these humble meals over and over again could get old quickly. I mean, who wouldn't get tired of the same few ingredients, day in and day out? But in a time when food wasn't guaranteed, and survival was the goal, peasants had to make do. And they did. They made the most of what they had: beans, peas, and whatever else they could get their hands on to provide the nutrition needed to get through the workday. So, next time you're thinking about how lucky you are to have a protein shake or a fancy protein bar, just remember the medieval peasants who kept their energy up with nothing more than a bowl of mushy peas and beans. Not exactly glamorous, but it was their fuel for survival. And that's something worth celebrating, don't you think? Now, let's talk about two essential vegetables that were everywhere in medieval peasant kitchens: cabbage and onions. If you thought medieval cuisine was all about hearty stews and dry bread, you'd be partially right. But these two humble veggies were what brought a little bit of life to otherwise bland meals. They were so central to the diet that if you didn't have cabbage or onions in your garden, you weren't doing medieval life right. First, let's discuss cabbage, a vegetable that could be grown in almost any soil, making it perfect for the resource-strapped peasant. Not only did it grow easily, but it was incredibly versatile. You could eat cabbage fresh, or you could preserve it by fermenting it into sauerkraut, a process that ensured the cabbage would last through the winter months when fresh produce was hard to come by. Sauerkraut was a godsend during the cold season, providing essential vitamin C when scurvy from lack of fresh fruits was a genuine concern. What's more, cabbage heads could weigh up to 15 pounds, meaning one plant could feed a family for a while. When you think about garden space being limited, cabbage was the ideal plant. It provided calories, fiber, and a bunch of vitamins, all while being able to grow in the worst possible soil. A single patch of land could yield enough cabbage to feed a family for months. This green wonder also had the added benefit of being self-sustaining. You could harvest the outer leaves regularly, and the plant would keep growing. It was like having a meal that replenished itself. Cabbage wasn't without its downsides, though. It's not exactly a luxurious food. In fact, when eaten too much, it could cause some unfortunate side effects, mainly because it's known to produce gas which, as you can imagine, was less than ideal for communal living. A medieval court record once mentioned cabbage problems at a banquet, stating that after eating too much cabbage, guests were often found with some unpleasant symptoms. It might not have been the most elegant of foods, but it was practical, and it got the job done. Alongside cabbage, onions were a peasant's best friend. Onions were cheap, easy to grow, and could thrive in any soil, just like cabbage. But what really made onions shine was their ability to add flavor, something desperately needed in a diet full of bland grains and root vegetables. These little bulbs added a punch to otherwise tasteless meals, transforming a pot of stew into something with character. Whether boiled, sautéed, or added raw to salads, onions were the vegetable that made everything taste just a bit better. Onions weren't just for flavor, though. They were packed with vitamins and antioxidants, which made them a valuable addition to any meal. They were especially useful in soups and stews, providing a base layer of flavor without much effort. And because they could be stored for months, they were a reliable food source throughout the year, whether fresh or dried. Onions also had some practical benefits. Medieval gardeners would often plant them around other crops to help keep bugs away. This made onions not only a food source, but also a kind of natural pest control. A little gardening trick like that could mean fewer pests and a more successful crop. But let's not sugarcoat it. Cabbage and onions didn't exactly make the most glamorous meals. They were functional, more than anything, and while they added flavor, they didn't exactly elevate a meal to the level of a gourmet feast. They were the unsung heroes of the medieval kitchen, providing necessary nutrition and a little zest in an otherwise bland diet. Sometimes, peasants would even get lucky and be able to mix up their meals with a little offal, the parts of slaughtered animals that most people would rather throw away. These scraps, like organs, heads, and feet, were a valuable source of protein when meat was scarce. While the wealthier classes got to enjoy tender cuts of meat, peasants had to make do with lesser parts, which they often turned into dishes like haggis or blood pudding. The less glamorous cuts of meat might not have been the star of the show, but they served their purpose. The importance of cabbage, onions, and the occasional bit of offal can't be overstated. These vegetables and scraps were the difference between a meager meal and no meal at all, especially during winter or times of famine. The ability to grow and preserve cabbage and onions made them indispensable, and their low cost and reliable yield made them cornerstones of the medieval diet. And let's not forget about wild foods, but we'll get to those in a bit. For now, let's just say cabbage and onions were the flavor foundations that kept everything from tasting like a sad, flavorless mess. They were the seasoning, in a world where seasonings were a luxury. Not glamorous, sure, but essential? Absolutely. In medieval times, if you were a peasant, your fast food wasn't a greasy burger or a slice of pizza. It was salted herring. This humble fish played a crucial role in the diet of medieval peasants, serving as a cheap, preserved source of protein that could be eaten anytime, anywhere. It wasn't fancy, but it was practical. And in a world where fresh food could spoil in a day or two, herring was a lifesaver. The key to herring's medieval dominance was its preservation. Salt was the main method used to preserve herring, allowing it to be stored for long periods without spoiling. In fact, salted herring was one of the main staples of the medieval diet, especially during religious fasting periods when meat was prohibited. Since meat was a luxury most peasants couldn't afford, herring became an essential protein source during these fasting days. It could be consumed without cooking. Just grab a salted fish, eat it, and you were good to go. It was the medieval version of the instant meal. Herring was cheap, available in huge quantities, and easy to store. During peak fishing seasons, herring would be caught in massive numbers, sometimes in the millions. In fact, a single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth, England, could haul in over 40 million herring in just a few weeks. That's a lot of fish. For peasants, who had little access to fresh meats, herring was a reliable protein source that could be easily salted and transported to far-off regions, allowing people in remote areas to still get their fish fix. But let's not forget, herring wasn't just a convenience food. It was an important food source for the church, too. Fasting days, especially during Lent, prohibited the consumption of meat, but fish was allowed. That's where salted herring came in, offering peasants and monks alike an easy, no-fuss way to adhere to the fasting rules while still getting much-needed calories. In fact, church records show that large quantities of herring were purchased each year from monastery meals. It was a true staple in their medieval food pyramid. The process of preserving herring was simple, yet effective. Fish were gutted, salted heavily, and packed tightly in barrels. The smell of a herring processing area was enough to knock you out. Imagine working near a smelly dock all day, surrounded by salted fish being packed for long journeys to other towns. They had to keep the smelly zones away from the main town centers, as the stench could be unbearable. Herring breath became a real occupational hazard, as even after it was prepared, the fish left a strong scent in the air and on your breath. It wasn't the best scent to impress the neighbors or the in-laws, but it was the kind of food you could get away with in a world where hunger trumped fresh breath. For peasants, herring wasn't just something to eat on fasting days. It was something they ate all the time. It was cheap, available, and nutritious. And it didn't just stop at the salted whole fish. Peasants would chop the fish into smaller pieces, mixing them into pies, stews, and spreads. Herring was a cheap, quick, and effective way to add some protein to the daily meal without having to wait for fresh meat to arrive. Of course, if you weren't quite in the mood for salted herring, the next option was to go for fresh fish, which, let's face it, was rare for most peasants. But even fresh fish couldn't compare to herring in terms of preservation. The salted version was always ready to go, and if you were really in a pinch, You could make a herring spread or soup with whatever herbs or vegetables you had on hand, creating a meal with minimal effort. Despite its constant presence in medieval life, eating herring day in and day out must have gotten a bit old. I mean, how many days can you eat salted fish before you start wishing for something different? But even then, herring had one more trick up its sleeve. It could last for months. When you're in a medieval village without refrigeration, and your food supplies are running low, the ability to rely on preserved fish for several months is priceless. While the flavor of salted herring might not have won any awards, its ability to travel well and keep made it the perfect long-term solution for a population that couldn't always rely on fresh food. And if you're wondering how much herring the average person ate, the numbers might shock you. Records from medieval England show that a fishing town called Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually, with each monastery sometimes purchasing thousands of herring a year just to feed its residents. One monk in England was recorded to have consumed 500 herring per year. Now that's a serious fish commitment. The only downside? Well, after a steady diet of herring, you might start craving something else, like maybe a nice piece of beef or a fruit salad. But for the medieval peasants, the world was one of scarcity, and herring was their staple. It wasn't about taste, it was about survival. And in that sense, salted herring really was the medieval fast food. Salted fish, bread, and maybe some boiled turnips? That was enough to make sure you got through another day of hard labor. As much as medieval peasants relied on their staples, the humble turnip, cabbage, and salted herring, there were times when even these basic foods weren't enough. The medieval diet wasn't one of choice or luxury. It was about making do with whatever you could find, often supplementing the usual fare with whatever nature provided. In this context, wild foods became an essential part of the peasant's survival toolkit, offering a bit of variety and nutrition when the usual supplies ran low. One of the most important wild foods was berries. Picture it. Summer mornings, when the fields and forests were bursting with a colorful array of wild strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries. These little gems were nature's sweet treat, and while they weren't available year-round, they were a welcome burst of flavor and nutrition in the warmer months. Medieval peasants, especially those in rural areas, would gather wild berries from hedgerows, forests, and meadows, stockpiling them for later use. But they couldn't just pop them in a freezer like we do today. No, they had to be more creative with their preservation techniques. Some berries would be dried or used to make jams and jellies if the weather allowed, but many were simply consumed fresh, providing essential vitamin C that could stave off scurvy. And don't forget the wild rose hips, full of vitamin C and often used to make syrups, or even added to soups and stews for a little extra tang. These berries weren't just tasty, they were medicinal too. Medieval peasants understood, even if they didn't fully grasp the science behind it, that these wild foods were crucial to maintaining health in times when other sources of nutrition were scarce. Another important wild food were acorns. For most people today, acorns are little more than a seasonal nuisance, dropping from oak trees and cluttering yards. But for medieval peasants, they were a lifesaver in times of food shortage. Acorns are packed with starch and energy, which made them an ideal backup food when grain supplies ran low. However, acorns come with a catch. They're bitter and inedible in their raw state due to the tannins they contain. So, peasants had to get creative, using water to leach out the bitterness by soaking and boiling the acorns for days. Once processed, acorns could be ground into flour and mixed with other grains to make bread or porridge. The taste wasn't exactly gourmet, but in times of famine, these acorns were worth their weight in gold. When they weren't picking berries or processing acorns, peasants also sought out chestnuts, another wild food that proved crucial during the winter months. Unlike acorns, chestnuts were much easier to eat. They didn't require the long processing time of acorns, and they were naturally sweet. Chestnuts could be roasted, boiled, or even ground into flour to stretch the supplies of bread. In parts of Europe, chestnuts were sometimes called bread trees because their starchy nuts could replace grains when grain supplies were tight. One chestnut tree could produce up to 200 pounds of nuts in a good year, enough to feed a family for weeks or even months if stored correctly. These little nuts were a vital resource in times of need, and peasants who had access to chestnut forests were lucky indeed. But wild foods weren't just a means of survival, they were also an opportunity for community gathering. Peasants would go out together to gather wild fruits and nuts, especially during the harvest season when other crops had been reaped. It wasn't just about food, it was also a chance to bond and connect with neighbors and family. Foraging for wild foods was an activity that brought people together, helping them to stretch their food supplies and share the load during times of plenty or scarcity. The wild foods they gathered, berries, acorns, chestnuts, added an extra layer of nutrition and variety to the medieval diet. But what's fascinating is how ingrained wild food gathering was in the everyday life of peasants. It wasn't a special occasion or something that happened once in a while. It was a regular activity that helped make up for the lack of variety in their diet. And for many peasants, foraging wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a matter of survival. Even in a world where limited resources meant eating the same foods day after day, peasants found ways to adapt and survive, turning to the forest and field for their wild bounty. It's a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of medieval peasants who turned whatever they could find into sustenance. The next time you walk through a forest and see a patch of wild berries or notice an oak tree filled with acorns, remember that for the peasants of the medieval world, these small, seemingly insignificant foods were often the difference between hunger and survival. Now that we've explored the major staples in the medieval peasant diet, let's take a step back and look at the big picture, how these humble ingredients came together in the medieval kitchen. The concept of resourceful cooking wasn't just a trend back then. It was a matter of survival. The medieval peasant didn't have the luxury of walking into a supermarket and grabbing whatever they wanted for dinner. No, they had to make do with what they had, and that often meant improvising with whatever ingredients were at hand. If you had a patch of land and a few basic tools, you were in business. For most peasants, a typical meal could be assembled with a handful of root vegetables, some stale bread, a bit of preserved herring, and maybe a few wild herbs or berries. The goal wasn't necessarily to create a flavor explosion, it was to fill bellies and give people the energy they needed to get through another grueling day of work. And let's be honest, when you're doing back-breaking labor from dawn until dusk, you don't have the time or luxury to worry about delicate flavors or gourmet plating. In fact, simplicity was key. A medieval meal often consisted of whatever was left from the day before, cooked up with whatever fresh ingredients were available. A few carrots, some wilted cabbage, maybe a handful of peas, and you've got yourself a hearty meal. Throw in a bit of stale bread to soak up the broth, and you've got pottage or gruel. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and that's what mattered. This kind of flexible cooking, known as the "what's available today" approach, was the backbone of medieval cuisine. It was cooking by necessity, not by design. And then there's the fact that, in a time when meat was rare, peasants didn't waste any part of the animals they did get their hands on. Offal, the organs, heads, feet, and other less desirable parts of an animal, became a crucial part of the peasant diet. Now, if you're imagining some gourmet offal dishes, let's be clear, these weren't the kinds of cuts that made it onto fine dining menus. But they did what they needed to do. They provided nutrition. The brains, intestines, heart, and liver were often boiled, fried, or made into blood pudding, or even stuffed into animal stomachs and made into haggis-like dishes. This wasn't luxury food. It was about not letting anything go to waste. Every single part of the animal was utilized, as it should be, in order to stretch food supplies. The versatility of peasants' cooking didn't stop there. Leftovers were king. If you had a bit of bread left from the day before, it was either tossed into your pot of pottage or used to make gruel. It wasn't fancy, but it was practical. There was no concept of a wasteful meal. You worked with what you had, and you didn't throw anything away. Any leftover meat or fish? Toss it into a stew or soup, and it would be enough to feed a family for a few more days. This approach wasn't just about economics. It was also about keeping people fed in the face of uncertainty. After all, when your next meal wasn't guaranteed, everything had value. Think about the wild foods we talked about earlier. These weren't just random treats. They were part of the survival strategy too. Wild mushrooms, berries, acorns, chestnuts. These weren't just things peasants could gather for fun. These were nutrient-dense foods that helped fill in the nutritional gaps when other ingredients were low. It was a bit like a medieval version of foraging for dinner, with an added layer of creativity. If you were lucky enough to find wild greens like dandelions or wild garlic growing in the forest, you could throw them in your pot and add a little extra nutrition and flavor. It wasn't just about filling the stomach, it was about making sure everyone got as much as they could from the food available to them. But even when it came to cooking techniques, peasants had to be resourceful. Without ovens or modern cooking gadgets, everything was cooked over an open fire or in a cauldron on a simple hearth. No fancy cookware here, just a pot, a fire, and whatever ingredients were on hand. If there was a need for a quick meal, ash cakes were the answer. This primitive bread didn't require an oven, it was just a mix of whatever ground meal you had left, often with ground acorns or other fillers, water, and a little bit of ash from the fire. You would flatten the paste into a round shape and cook it directly in the hot ashes. The result was a smoky, often gritty, bread-like substance that wasn't about taste, it was about calories. These quick, rough meals weren't something to celebrate, but they kept peasants alive when food supplies ran low. Even holidays and celebrations didn't bring much relief from the resourceful cooking lifestyle. Special occasions might bring out a little meat or a spice if they could get their hands on it, but they didn't have elaborate meals or fancy desserts. Their idea of a feast was likely a hearty dish of wild greens and salted meat with some fresh herbs sprinkled on top. But even in the face of adversity, peasants found ways to celebrate the small victories, whether it was a good harvest, a successful hunt, or simply getting through another week of work. They knew how to make a meal from the least promising of ingredients. Medieval peasant cooking wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. Every meal was a creative act of resourcefulness, ensuring that, with a little ingenuity, you could keep your family fed through the most difficult of times. Every ingredient, from breadcrumbs to offal, was treated as a precious resource, and nothing went to waste. They were masters of adaptation, cooking with what they had, when they had it, and making the most of every opportunity for sustenance.